Right, good afternoon everybody and welcome to this Easter Bank Holiday Monday webinar, which has been jointly hosted by the Institute for Prosperity and the Institute of Economic Affairs. But my name is Brendan Chilton. I'm going to be chairing this session. Just a few notes before we begin. We're hosting this on Zoom, but we will be uploading it to YouTube at a later date. If you can put your questions in the Q&A Zoom chat function, if you're struggling for a question, you can vote for any that appear in there. You can just simply prop them up the poll there and we'll pick the ones that come to the top. All of those in the audience on Zoom, if you could just remain mute, we will be remaining on mute throughout the event, just to avoid any background noise and distractions and other chaotic things that happen in people's homes while they're trying to have meetings. We're going to give the panelists a few minutes for opening comments, just kick off this event. So please feel free to submit a question at any time. Now today we are joined by Professor Philip Booth, who is Director of the Vinson Centre and Professor of Economics at the University of Birmingham, Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University, Twickenham, and a Senior Academic Fellow at the IEA. He's written very widely, including a number of books on investment, finance, social insurance and pensions, as well as the relationship between Catholic social teaching and economics. For the Institute of Economic Affairs, Philip wrote Federal Britain, a publication which argued for extensive decentralization in the UK to promote economic growth and improve public finances. We are also joined by Mr. Patrick Christys, who's a well-known and award-winning journalist, broadcaster and political commentator who's featured on Sky News, the BBC, and regularly presents on talkRADIO. He's previously hosted the National Breakfast Show on Love Sport Radio, for which he won the Radio Academy's prestigious 30 Under 30 award. Caroline Flint is the chair of the Institute for Prosperity's advisory board. Caroline is the well-known figure in politics and in the media, having been in the front line of British politics for 22 years, 6 as a government minister and 5 as Shadow Secretary of State for the Environment. Caroline has been a passionate, energy, not environment, energy. Caroline has been a passionate advocate for rebalancing the UK economy and investment in the North, having served as chair of the Northern Powerhouse All Parliamentary Group, and most importantly, is recent celebrity mastermind champion. And you can all see that online if you haven't already. And then finally, but not, we've got John Mills, who's a businessman, economist, and an author who's been involved in political affairs for many years. John has been a Labour Party supporter, donor, and activist for over 50 years. As an economist, his main interests are the relatively poor performance of Western economies compared with those in the East and the UK's relationship with the EU. John was formerly the chairman and then deputy chairman of Vote Leave, co-chair of Business for Britain, and the founder of Labour Leave, all campaigning for Brexit during and in the run-up to the 2016 referendum. John is the vice chair of the Economic Research Council and founder of Labour Future and the John Mills Institute for Prosperity, all concerned in different ways with the way the UK's economic and political prospects will develop over the next few years. Now, to start with, I'm going to go to John Mills and ask if he can just make some opening comments just for 2 minutes on where he sees things at the moment. So, John, over to you.
Well, I think the big problem that we've got in the UK is we've got London, which has got a surplus with the rest of the world, got plenty to sell to everybody else, and the rest of the country, which has in aggregate got a huge deficit. You can see how big the deficit is. If the total balance of payments to the UK is about 100 billion negative every year, and the city's got a 50 billion pound, or London's got a 50 billion pound surplus, the rest of the country is in deficit to 150 billion on a turnover of about 1.5 trillion, which means the whole of the rest of the country outside London is running at a deficit of about 10%. Now, you've got some cities there, like Manchester and Bristol and Oxford and Cambridge are doing fairly well, which means lots of other areas of the country are doing even worse. And the real problem about all these places is that with the deindustrialization that's taken place, they just haven't got enough to sell to the rest of the world. And I think that until you give these people in all these large areas of the country an opportunity to engage in economic activity which can be sold elsewhere, you're never really going to get the leveling up that everybody wants. And the reason why this has happened, I think, is because of the industrialization that's taken place, denuding these places of economic activity. You're never going to get that back unless it becomes profitable to invest in manufacturing in this country, which patently it isn't, because over the last 40 years, the proportion of GDP from manufacturing has gone down from about 32% to 10%, and there's no prospect of it coming back unless profitability is vastly increased. And the only way you're going to do that is to have a change in economic policy towards a much lower exchange rate to make it possible and profitable to invest in this country rather than elsewhere. So that, in a nutshell, I think, is what the problem is.
Thank you, John. I now want to go over, if I can, to Philip Booth. Philip, just 2 to 3 minutes on where you think we should be going.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree very much, actually, with John in terms of the geography of the problem, if you like, but we disagree quite profoundly in terms of solutions. So I think the debate on levelling up in general is dogged by the widespread belief that the North is somehow a sort of a homogenous zone of poverty. This isn't helped by the fact that ministers tend to be sent to the poor bits of the North on visits followed by cameras to see the opening of a new factory, as if this is some kind of once in a millennia event. It might be worth noting that 2 parliamentary constituencies that have been Conservative the longest are Horsham in Sussex, about 14 miles from where I'm sitting right now, and Halton Price just outside Hull in East Yorkshire, where I spent my childhood. And the socio-economic characteristics of both are very, very similar. It's also important to note that the regions of the UK have very similar levels of productivity, except for 3 of them. Let's call that level 100. Then those 3 exceptions are Scotland, the level of productivity of which will be about 115, the South East, which will be about 120, and London, which will be about 140. But the South East and London, of course, are also very expensive places to live. So their net advantage, if you like, from being higher wage economists is not perhaps that huge. Basically, there's one high productivity industry that employs a huge number of people in the UK, financial services, which is centred on London, the South East and Scotland. So this leads to a problem. If you want to level up, you can't simply turn low productivity industries into high productivity industries or move the high productivity industries into the other regions. But I think you can do 3 things. The first is radically decentralised government. We know that this increases productivity. You get better matching of public goods to local needs, competition between local government, more trial and error with different approaches in different places and so on. Secondly, there's a very strong explanatory factor of productivity and earnings differences, which is essentially differences in education between London and the South East and the rest of the country. This is partly because of the drift of well-educated people towards London and the South East, which we wouldn't want to stop. But it's also because educational achievement outside London and the South East seems to be lower too. And we'll all have different views on how to fix that, but it should at least be part of the discussion. Finally, I would call for radical liberalisation of land use planning, not because I always do, and you might think this benefits London and the South East most, but actually it's the productivity of industries which are common in the North that has been particularly severely damaged by planning regulation. And also housing costs are a serious drag on real wages in every area of England. In fact, houses at the bottom quartile for lower earners are more expensive in the northeast today than they were in London in 1997. That's an extraordinary fact, given how high housing costs in London were in the late 1990s. So I think, though, this is a very complex problem, and it's not amenable to simple solutions. And I don't believe that targeted regional or industrial policies have any chance of success whatsoever. But I think there are policies you can follow that are likely to disproportionately benefit those regions outside London and the South East.
Thank you, Philip. Well, now we are actually going to go to sunny Doncaster. Caroline, can you give us your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Brendan, and happy Easter Monday to everyone who's tuned in. Yeah, I mean, look, Philip is right that the story of the North, or for that matter, the Midlands, is not all about doom and gloom. There are some very successful parts of the north of England, and there are towns within the north of England that are affluent and successful too. But alongside that, I think is a sorry tale of how in many of those communities, in Stockton, where my husband is from, and Teesside, in Doncaster and elsewhere. The transition from those major industries in terms of steel, coal and chemicals has been one in which I don't think those communities got as much, if you like, support and encouragement to make a transition as much as they should have done. And if I think back to 1997, when I first got elected, we still had one coal mine in my constituency, a deep coal mine that was operating. And there was another one in Doncaster North as well, both now gone. But what also was there was the fact that for a community in which was built on coal and rail, how little thought had been undertaken by government to say, right, we're not going to carry on as we were. That was going to happen. It probably would have changed under a Labour government as well. But how do we address that these communities, proud of what they contributed locally and nationally to the national effort, were not going to be feeling left behind over the next 20 years? And to my mind, you know, part of the problem was a sort of sense that these were old-fashioned areas, old-fashioned industries in which there wasn't an attempt in any real way to make a transition to a different type of work, a different type of living. And key to that was things like education. If you worked in a coal mine in the latter part of the 20th century compared to where it was before World War II, you were on pretty good pay and you were leaving school with few qualifications but still being paid a good wage. That went, and that wage that you got that then contributed to the local economy went as well. So I think that it is not about having some old-fashioned view, but I think we have to recognise that whilst in the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen an amazing renaissance of our cities, both in the south and in the north, which is fantastic, it has masked the sort of sense of feeling not part of that success in many of our towns, post-industrial towns and communities. And in many respects, I think the financial crash in 2007-8 really revealed how weak those economies were in those communities. Because it is true to say, even today, and obviously we've just gone through the pandemic, that many people in those communities have not had a pay rise for some 20 odd years in any real terms. And I think this isn't just about an economic problem, it's a social problem as well. I don't believe that markets just exist outside of government. In different ways, every market we have in the UK is managed in some respect. All those industries that were privatised under Margaret Thatcher, energy, they are managed markets. They weren't private markets in the way we would have been led to believe they were to become. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be lazy about this or just think the state can do everything. But the state does play a role in making sure we have the right laws, the right incentives, the right skills, the right education, and the right infrastructure to enable communities to flourish and to make changes and make transitions where they need to. And I think that has been lacking, because all the talk about levelling up at the moment, and I've had a parade of people come to me saying, could you offer some comment for our book about the red wall seats? Can you tell us about this? I'm writing a book. Well, this has been going on for a long time and isn't new. And it's a sad reflection on our country that in being almost in thrall to globalization and the net benefits of our economy, we absolutely ignored what was happening in some of those communities for whom they were once the powerhouse that drove our economy. And with that, the pride they felt in themselves, their communities and their family. So we've got to address this. And I think one of the reasons why I'm involved with John and the Institute for Prosperity is manufacturing is one of the areas of our economy where we could do a lot more and restore some pride and money in the pocket to those people in those towns.
Thank you, Caroline. I now want to come over to Patrick. Patrick, this is the levelling up agenda is going to be the issue really over the next few years as we come out of the recession. Talk us through your experience of this. How are the public feeling? How seriously are politicians taking this? And your thoughts on where we go from here.
Well, I'm dialing in today from the wonderful sunny Cheshire. We had a bit of a Michael Fish moment earlier. We were told we were going to get the Arctic tundra, and actually it's just glorious sunshine. So we're all right. But yes, no, look, I think we're a funny little country, aren't we? Really, we've got so many different accents, so many different cultural nuances, even just domestically, regardless of the amount of immigration that we have, etc. We're quite a unique nation in that respect. And for me, it's astonishing how much of this nation is considered an afterthought all too often by central governments, actually. When I was working up as a local reporter up in Cumbria about 4 or 5 years ago, there were some devastating floods. And this summed it up for me, the way that I felt that central, particularly Conservative governments at that time, felt about the North. David Cameron arrived, in his ministerial jags or whatever, had a very quick meeting on his own with a couple of local dignitaries in an isolated National Trust lodge, then put up an advert to visit Cumbria at Heathrow Airport, and then just didn't bother coming back. And what happened next year? It flooded again, and they're in exactly the same situation. That, to me, summed up a little bit about maybe the view of the north of England from a lot of our leaders down in the south there. I think fundamentally now you're going to hear a lot of more economic experts than I am, and I would never pretend to be that, the people on this very panel. But from my perspective, slightly more of a political, or dare I say it, I don't know, maybe practical human level in a sense. There are a lot of people in the north have been feel like they've been let down by the Conservative government for years, right? And actually maybe now they've just about got their trust back. That trust was based singularly, a lot of it, around the fact that they actually thought that Jeremy Corbyn might be more actively dangerous than Boris Johnson. And so therefore they vote for Boris Johnson. And now he's actually got to do something about this. And a way of doing this politically to secure the fact that Labour won't frankly win maybe for generations to come, is to get this levelling up right, okay? Because you get a lot of the younger generation now, people my age, I'm an exception, right? Most of them are left-wing. I would actually regard most of them as being nothing, but they just think they're left-wing because they don't want to say they're a Tory. But that said, so now actually what they need to do is actually put their money where their mouth is in the north of England. Otherwise, the trust is gone. And frankly, you are just going to end up with a lot of people my age who will always vote Labour. So that needs to happen in a practical sense. I'm just wondering, various areas. The brain drain has been mentioned a lot. The brain drain has been mentioned, a couple of times anyway in this issue. Again, when I was living up in Cumbria, anyone who kind of wanted to be someone decided that they had to leave Cumbria for some reason in order to do that, and therefore go down to London. I know that is reflected up and down the country. We look at things as well, like when older people are looking to retire places. I know that places like the Lake District has a high elderly population, but actually, if you look at places like that, some people think, well, I don't really want to retire to the north because the hospital's worse than they are down south. And so almost from life to death, you end up with this big question mark over whether or not the north is in some way worse and therefore more deadly than the south. Also, we talk a lot about transport. HS2 is coming in. I'm not sure how successful that's going to be. And tourism as well, especially in this current COVID climate that we've got now. I mean, when I used to go to Morecambe, you'd see a statue of Eric Morecambe there, doing his little dance saying, what was it, bring me sunshine. It was never more catastrophically ironic than when it was, covered in bird poo and it was raining and there were, empty barbecues on the beach and all this stuff. You think, can we not actually do something a little bit more to try and boost the domestic tourism economy and drag people towards places like Morecambe? Look, we could talk about this all day. I'm sure we're going to. That's some of my initial views anyway.
So I just want to touch on, there's a couple of themes that have come through this. The first one being this brain drain down to London. Philip spoke about the need for decentralization. I wonder if we can just go into that a little bit more, Philip. I mean, what would it look like? I mean, unfortunately, I'm a complete barbarian. I haven't read your book. Could you just tell us, in summary, what it would look like, what it would mean, and what your sort of hypothesis is for how this could help level up Britain?
Okay, so I mean, it's become a commonplace to say that the UK has the most centralised governmental system in the world. So measured by the proportion of all spending undertaken by local governments, we're not quite there. We're roughly equal with France. But if you measure centralisation by the proportion of the tax take, which is taken by subnational government, we are the most centralised by a very long chalk. It's about 5% as compared with around about 10 to 15% for the next most centralised. And then you get countries like Canada, where 50% of all government of all taxation is actually undertaken at the sub-national government level. So what would it mean in practice? Well, the economic literature actually suggests that it's the worst of all worlds is to have a system of local government which has no responsibility for taxation, or almost no responsibility for taxation, but quite a lot of responsibility for spending, because it just ends up as a sort of giant lobbying organisation trying to get more money out of Westminster. And instead of local authorities being accountable to the people, they become accountable to bureaucrats in Westminster. So what would look like in practice is that local government would have a much broader tax raising powers. It must have a broad tax base, otherwise you get the problems that we had in the 70s and early 80s of local government going absolutely wild at the expense of a narrow tax base. Many of the functions which are currently done by local government directly regulated by central government, the number of statutory responsibilities of local government is enormous, would simply become local government responsibilities which local government would choose how they fulfilled those functions. So by and large, they choose what the tax rate was. They would have more responsibility for regulation as well, I would suggest. Why do we have things like shopping hours determined by central government? And they would have more responsibility for spending. And you get much more local variety, like you do if you go into continental Europe or Canada or the United States. And you get policies which were much better suited to the local environment. We wouldn't need to have discussions about David Cameron going up to Cumbria, because this would not be David Cameron's problem, and it needn't be David Cameron's problem.
John, Philip touched on devolution. He also touched on the questions around planning. And I just wonder, I know you're very interested in getting manufacturing revived and restoring those sort of manufacturing jobs to other parts of the country. To what extent is the current government model and the planning system a barrier to that happening?
Well, I think it may be a bit of a barrier. I mean, I spent 35 years in local government, and so I've got some experience of all this. But I just don't think that what local government does makes a huge difference to what needs to be done to get the levelling up agenda in place. I mean, I think the real problem with so much of the country, and indeed manufacturing generally in the UK, is that the costs that we charge the rest of the world for our overhead costs, and that's not just direct labor, it's management, it's the overhead costs of running a business, it's interest rates, it's taxation, is just way too high for manufacturing. It actually is not necessarily too high for services. Services do quite well with $1.50 to the pound, but manufacturing doesn't. And the evidence for all this is really staring us in the face. The proportion of GDP coming from manufacturing has gone down, as I said earlier on, from 32% in 1970 to less than 10% now. Our share of world trade has gone down and down and down. And the reason for this is it's just more expensive to produce manufactured goods in this country than it is just about anywhere else. And I have direct experience of this all the time with the company that I built up over the years, which sells and products that gets manufactured all over the world. So what I would say to you is there may well be a case for doing something to change the balance between the centre and local authorities, but that's not going to solve the problem that we're talking about today of levelling up.
So John, you just spoke about your company there that makes goods particularly from the Far East. What would you say? I mean, I know you say the cost of investment, but what single policy could we change to make it more profitable for your firm and others, instead of making goods in China or Malaysia or Hong Kong, to bring them over here, to make them in Doncaster, to make them in Redcar and other parts of the UK?
Well, I think there are two sides to all this. There's a supply side element to it all, which is making sure that the balance, there's enough planning flexibility for industry, there's enough money for investment, all this kind of thing, more education and training. But if you don't marry that up with the right sort of demand side, which is really a macroeconomic and exchange rate policy, the supply side issues just won't cut the mustard. What you need is a balanced approach to make it cheaper through the exchange rate to manufacture in the UK, and then you need all the supply side to come in behind it to make sure it actually happens. But I think if we don't do this, we're just going to maunder along with a growth rate of maybe 1% or something per annum, and we'll finish up with living standards in this country being no higher in 2030 than they were in 2019 or even 2007. A whole generation of wasted years and stagnant incomes.
Caroline, if I can bring you in, you touched on the fact that there are actually quite a lot of affluent areas in the north of England. Us people down here in the south, we think of sort of dark satanic mills and misery and flat caps, but actually there are some areas doing very, very well up there. So my question is it less about north versus south, or are there sort of issues sort of east to west in the north? For example, I know when I've been to Newcastle and I want to then get down to Manchester, it's quicker to come down to London sometimes and then go back up rather than go across. Is it about town versus village and rural communities, or is it really north-south? What's your view on what you've heard so far?
I think, going back to actually Patrick's point, I think we have such a lack of discussion about the diversity within our country. I mean, on one hand, we have a big discussion about diversity. On another level, we don't. And part of what is not reflected is actually what's really going on within, regions of our country, and which is a shame. I mean, I can remember having, I'm not going to name names, I can remember having a few front benchers up for our annual Don Valley dinner. And I think most of them thought that somewhere like Doncaster, which obviously coal mining was the key industry, along with rail, was going to be like Coronation Street, which is that back-to-back housing, which is much more built about, cities and those sort of factories. And I said, you know what? I mean, coal mining was effectively people coming along and digging a big hole in the countryside, and then it sprouted out from that. So even in the sort of, 21st century, politicians not really having a sense of place and these and how they worked. And Cumbria, my family is originally from a little place called Burneside, just outside of Kendal. I had family who made the journey down from Scotland and across from Liverpool to work in Cropper's paper mill, which I have to say is still there, and it sounds a lovely, fantastic Victorian name. But but the fact is, people move away if there aren't opportunities. And to just give you an example of the brain drain, we know that amongst our brightest graduate teachers, because they're young, they're going to go to the cities. So they will be working in challenging places within Leeds, Sheffield, Birmingham, London, wherever, working with some of the communities that most need the best teachers. But they go there because they will work in those communities, probably find somewhere to live, but also they've got the life that a young person in their 20s wants. We can't attract in some of our more provincial towns that sort of pathway to help our children. So, we've got to be more creative about this. I would love it if there was a young person who wanted to live in Sheffield, but they were brilliant as a first-time teacher to come in Doncaster. Let's pay their transport. Let's have an incentive there so we can connect them to the places where they can work, which, to be honest, compared to when I used to commute in London years ago, isn't that far away, but we can have an incentive there. Or for those bright teachers who may be looking for their second teaching job and may want to start raising a family, and therefore they're thinking about a property that they can have their first child in. Why don't we look at the places like Doncaster and elsewhere where actually we've got nice housing, it's cheaper, but actually that's an incentive to attract those teachers there. Now, I'm not saying that's going to solve everything, but it's the lack of practical thinking about how you join the dots, how you provide the incentives, how you showcase an area. And, Doncaster, I mean, back in 97, someone said to me, nobody's going to pay more than 30p for a cup of coffee. They're now paying £2. I mean, things change. And there are some things that are still holding us back, but there's parts of what we are as a community that are way distant from people's perception of who we are. That doesn't mean there aren't challenges there, and we have to address that. And if I'm going to say one thing on Philip's thing about, I support decentralization, right? But to be honest, I'm not sure that the best way to promote that is to start talking about tax raising in our regions. In the northeast of England, as we remember, they had a vote on going to a more regional government there, and they turned it down. I think that we've got to be careful about this, about thinking we just build institutions and somehow that's going to solve all the problems here. And I say that as someone who does believe we should decentralize a lot more, but actually local government and regional government has to prove itself as well and be accountable if they are given powers for what they do. But what they can't do is take the powers, and if they make a mistake, then blame Westminster and Whitehall. That's what the Scottish government does.
Can I just
come back quickly, and then I want to bring Patrick in.
No, okay.
No, come back, and then I'll bring Patrick in.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think Caroline and I probably agree that I don't believe in regional government at all in England, actually. When I say local, I really do mean local. And I think one of the advantages of local government having a proper tax base is that they can then be blamed for their mistakes. Whereas at the moment, and the same is true in Scotland, Scotland doesn't have a proper tax base. It simply gets money devolved from earmarked taxes to.
But Philip, sorry, but if your local tax take is pretty low, I mean, let's be honest about it. Westminster could literally pave the streets with gold.
Yeah,
it's got so much money from its parking charges, it could do that. If you're in a low tax rate area like Doncaster and elsewhere, Stockton, you're never going to get enough tax take to necessarily do the things that you want to do within that community compared to more affluent areas. So there's going to have to be some redistribution in all that to make it work.
Yeah, no, and most countries do have some mechanism of equalisation, but none go to the extreme that we do of having 95% of all revenue, tax revenue that's raised by the central government.
Okay. I want to bring Patrick in now because I want to move now to some of the questions we've had coming in. I think this is a good moment to bring Patrick in. You mentioned, Patrick, that for the first time, many parts of North of England voted for the Conservatives, partly because of Brexit and also as part of this levelling up agenda. Now we've Brexited, if you like, and that's sort of behind us to a large extent, but not completely. A lot of the areas of the country have been reliant. This is a question from Emma Ravel in the chat. A lot of parts of the country have been reliant on EU development funds for some years. Now that we've Brexited, were those funds hindering or helping? And how is the government going to deliver on that levelling up agenda, which won the support of quite a lot of parts of the north of England?
Yeah, look, it's a fascinating point, isn't it? I think Wales as well was one of the areas benefited, I think, most, I'm right in saying, I think, from European development funds, and they obviously voted quite significantly to leave. So clearly in the public psyche, that just doesn't matter. However, there is the argument, no doubt, that people will make where it's like, well, actually, once practically that money has stopped coming in, what are you left with? And therefore, actually be okay to do it. Now, I think that for a long time in this country, we were lied to about the extent of the magic money tree that we had growing in our back garden. I understand that we have had to borrow a lot of money recently because of the pandemic, and I'm not always entirely in favour of that, of course. That inevitably is not free money, right? However, at the same time, when we were being told things like, actually, we don't have enough money at all, ever, to feed some hungry children, and we were told that it ultimately is the job of parents to feed their kids. Of course, ultimately it is the job of parents to feed their kids. I'm not disputing that. What I am saying is, if in a practical sense, sometimes they're not feeding their kids, could we not do it for them? And actually, we were told we didn't have any of that money. And it turns out we definitely did have that money. So it makes it look a little bit, in that sense, like the government didn't mind about starving children. And so we have got money now when it comes to things like, are we going to catastrophically fall apart as a result of the fact we haven't got the EU development funds? Undoubtedly, those funds will have gone towards benefiting those local areas, as long as they were not put straight in someone's back pocket, which is no evidence that they were. So they must have been, right? So my point is, I think we can stand alone anyway. And my other point is, I don't think people massively care too much whether or not there's a slight reduction in the amount of money that's coming into their area. I think that they want to see that money spent better and more visibly better. Because if you look at some of the areas where we've had our existing levels of EU funding, and you do take some places, some parts of the northeast, for example, and areas around that, when you go and see these kind of grey-coloured, almost Nordic-style BBC documentaries where they send Stacey Dooley up to go and ask people how they feel, and they all say that someone's there with like a can of special brew next to an empty dock saying, oh, there's nothing to live for around here. Well, there is stuff to live for around there, but we're allowing the perception of there to be that there's nothing to live for around there to foster. And once you get that ingrained into a community, once you get that ingrained into an area, then it's an absolutely terrible state of affairs. It's like a kind of a cancer, really. So what I would like to see is the government using targeted development funding in areas like that to why not as well create maybe perhaps some specialist areas. They're trying to do things in Manchester with like making it a bit of a media destination, of course. BBC's helped to do that a little bit. I think they're trying to do something similar in Leeds with Channel 4. Can we not be a bit more creative with this and have a look at, can there not be pockets of the UK that are basically there for something? That's where you have to go, or not have to go, but you could go if you really wanted to get the best kind of thing for that particular industry. I would like to see that. I think it would diversify our economy massively, and therefore it would be making the argument as well. And this is the main point now. And this costs nothing. Just to answer directly Emma's question about funding and government funding, this really costs nothing. The government should find it very easy to make the case that there is a good reason to live outside London. I can make it for you. When I moved down to London, I realised very quickly that not only could I not afford a house, I actually was struggling to afford one of Caroline's coffees that we were talking about all far too often. And it was incredibly busy, and it was a weird vibe to it. And I did actually feel a bit more threatened walking home at night than I did do in Cheshire, for example. There are loads of reasons why you can make a very good case very quickly to live outside London. It shouldn't be too difficult to do that. That's a way a government could go and level up. And then just practically speaking, again, don't give people the ammunition and the fodder to be able to go, well, I can afford a house in the Lake District, actually. And yes, I do feel safer and everything's a lot quieter. But you know what? I haven't even got broadband. So sort out people's broadband. Just take care of these little practical things that mean that people can't now go, actually, you know what? I'll stay in Islington.
Well, you couldn't have said it better myself. John, I want to bring you in. Patrick touched there on the questions around Brexit. You obviously chair of Vote Leave and have been a lifetime campaigner for Britain's departure from the EU. What benefits can the UK government now use in that levelling now that we're outside the EU that it couldn't use before? And what are the challenges going to be, as well as the opportunities of Brexit in that levelling up agenda?
Well, I must say, my view has always been that the economic benefits from leaving the EU were going to be relatively small, but I think they are there. And I think it does give us more opportunity for opening up trade negotiations with countries all over the world than we had before. It does give us more flexibility with the use of funds. I mean, one of the problems about the EU funds that we had when we were in the European Union was that people in Brussels decided where the money was going to go much more than we did in this country here. I think we've now got the capacity and freedom to decide where all that money is going to go and what to do with it. So there's quite a lot there. Clearly, we need some sort of industrial strategy. I'm not personally in favour of massive subsidies for industries and picking winners and all this sort of thing. But clearly, there are some crucial industries like steel, which we need to help. And we need to make sure that we've got the capacity for infrastructure development, broadband, all these other things that were mentioned just now. So I mean, I think that we have got more democratic control over where the money's going, and this ought to provide us with an opportunity to make sure that we prosper in the future. I don't think it's going to be a magic wand which is going to change everything, but I do think we've got opportunities now as opposed to how we use money, which we didn't have before.
Okay, we've had a question from Dave Smith, who says, do you think the pandemic's driven move to the country is a flash in the pan, or is this part of a longer trend? And will this have any impact on levelling up? John, while you're on, I want you to answer that if you can. Is this, exodus, if you like, from the cities a temporary thing, or is this going to become a trend? And how's that going to impact on the government's levelling up agenda?
I mean, I think there are huge uncertainties about what is going to happen in a whole range of areas when we get rid of the pandemic that we've got at the moment. I mean, what's going to happen, for example, to retail selling? Is that going to continue to be shifting towards direct to the consumer deliveries at the expense of bricks and mortar? Home working, what's going to happen to home working? Are people going to go on working from home the way they have been over the last year or two, or are they going to go back to offices? And there's all sorts of changes of structure that have happened in the way that businesses are run and the government operates. Are they going to be permanent, or are they going to be temporary? And I think one of the things that we need to do over the next period is to watch very carefully the way these trends are going and react to them in sensible ways. I think that to try and force everybody back into offices obviously doesn't make any sense. We've got to go with the flow. But I think it's going to present us with some very tricky problems about what we do to try and roll back the changes that have been made, and to what extent we've got to roll with the punch to go along with it. So I think the answer is it's difficult to give a proper, clear answer to the question we've just been asked, because there's so many uncertainties we don't really know.
Okay, Philip, you've got some views on this at all? Is this going to be a long-term trend, or is this just a temporary spad?
Well, as they say, it's dangerous, especially to make predictions about the future. But I think some history is interesting here. So there was a huge decline in the population of the cities from the early 1930s to sometime between the 1981 and 1991 census. And that was London, the population of which dropped by more than a quarter, to not much more than 6 million, Manchester, Liverpool, and largely to suburbs, and also a drift from north to south. So these sort of shifts in population do happen regularly in history. And there's been a significant increase in the population of cities recently, and I think that's probably contributed to their relative prosperity that Caroline was talking to, and compared with other places outside the main cities, because you do get economies of agglomeration, as economists call it, but it's also been the increased prosperity of the cities has also caused that drift back to the cities to some extent. And I think, to go back to land use planning and John's point about retail, I think what will be really crucial here is how local authorities deal with the significant changes that there will be in the use of office and retail property. Because if that's badly handled, a city or indeed a small town could just become a really unpleasant wasteland, not inhabited by businesses, not inhabited by people, becomes crime-ridden, then people don't want to live there and so on. On the other hand, and there are some good examples of this happening in the recent past, if it's well handled, if you allow the property to change use and so on, then the cities and town centres can become really vibrant spaces again where people do want to live and do business.
Okay, Caroline, we've had another question in. I think we can park that for the time being. There's another question coming. I know you're interested in the net zero target work. So there's a question here that says, could we combine levelling up and the net zero target and replace lost manufacturing in some areas with renewable energy and green technologies? Do you think that's something we can look at as part of the levelling up agenda?
Well, I've always thought that one of the great things about energy is it's one of those sectors that really does speak to rebalancing the economy, because you've either got a coastline that's really windy or you haven't. Basically, or you've got sites where our nuclear footprint is in Cumbria, in Wales, and Somerset and what have you. But and therefore it does speak to sort of something that isn't totally dominated by Cambridge and the south east, really. And to give you an example of that, over the way from me in Humber, we've got the Humber Hub, which is developing, looking at hydrogen. And they've got a similar thing happening in Aberdeen. So, and alongside that, you've obviously got the offshore wind industry all the way along that east coast, which obviously includes part of the east of England as well. So yes, there's real opportunities there, but how do you make sure that that is already happening and that will grow, which is great, but how do you make sure that we really max out the opportunities from that? And the question has to be, and it goes back to a point John was making earlier actually, about, well, how do we build the turbines? What steel are we going to be using for this? How do we create the supply chains? Could we, in Humberside, create something that they've got in Cambridgeshire, which is a sort of, almost a Humber Valley type of situation, where there's a whole, network of businesses that are supporting that industry in one way or another. I mean, I remember when we got our RAF Finningley become a small airport, it's still going. And I remember a guy coming to me when they were constructing the terminal, and he said, oh, I want to do business at the airport. And I said, oh, what sort of business have you got? He said, basically, I do bacon butties. And he said, I want to basically park my van up and sell tea, coffee, bacon sandwiches to the people doing the construction. You can create this sort of microcosm of industry and entrepreneurs alongside the big stuff, but you've got to have some weight behind it. And when it comes to something like energy and the net zero, it's about the decision that the government makes about what do we want, electric cars, heat pumps, that's great, get rid of your gas boilers, but who's going to make the new systems, and are they going to be made in Britain that are going to replace all those boilers, and are we going to train up the workforce to do that? So it's very possible in all this, but it's also got challenges, because some work that I'm doing at the moment clearly shows that some of the areas which have the highest emitting jobs are actually in those, if you like, communities that are talked about as being left behind. So it's in the North and the Midlands, where often you have these jobs that unless we do something to mitigate, they will further lose jobs unless something happens to replace those jobs or retrain those workers in those areas. So I'm always a cup half full person, Brendan, but this is an opportunity, but we can only realise the opportunity if government gets beyond the photo opportunities with the hard hats, as was mentioned earlier, and gets down into the detail of how you make this happen, because they really need to be ahead of this right now.
Can I bring you in on this? I mean, how seriously is the government taking the green agenda, the towards zero targets, and do you think, I know from your sort of phone-ins on your show, the public, how seriously are the public taking this, and how can they conceive of it happening? Can they conceive of us getting to this towards zero, and what does it mean to Joe public?
Yeah, I think no and very little is potentially the quickest way that I can answer that. And I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but I think that's the way it is. The fact is that most Conservative voters have never voted Conservative because of their green agenda. In fact, I'm not sure it's ever really, unless they've happened to have used a green pen to actually cross the ballot box thing, I don't think anything green has come into many people's views of conservatism in this country for a very long time. Therefore, you could argue that it's therefore not a practical vote winner and not something that a lot of people, especially perhaps in some of the red wall seats, as it were, are going to be massively bothered about as and when it comes to the next general election. Certainly, I don't think you're going to get many people going to shift from the Liberal Democrats or from the Labour Party or from the Green Party themselves to the Conservatives because they think the Conservative Party's green agenda is better. So I would always question how seriously the Conservative government, any Conservative government, would take a green agenda and how we're actually going to see that play out. Ultimately, we are in a votes-related business, aren't we, in politics? And that's kind of what matters when it comes to the next general election. I do think as well that, again, and I'm not saying this is correct, because I do think there should be more education about the environment, and people should care more about it. On account of the fact I imagine we would all like to keep going on living for quite a lot longer. That said, at the moment, there's a lot of other stuff going on, isn't there? We've just had a pandemic. Before that, people were not exactly flushed with cash as well. We've had lots of issues. We've cited loads of issues, especially in the north of England with regards to manufacturing being closed, all of the stuff we've spoken about here. Now, that has a very real, practical, tangible, day-to-day impact on people's lives. They can see that every time they go to the shops and they look at what they can afford on the shelves that day or whatever it is. Whereas, can you gradually see the ozone layer? Look, I've shown my own lack of education. Can we see whatever damage is happening to the ozone layer happening? No, we can't see it with the naked eye. And so that's one of the main issues that I think the Conservative government is always going to have. Just to touch on something that we said before, not directly relating to the green agenda, but I just wanted to bring it up. One area that I've always thought of, and this might sound a little bit out there, and this is actually kind of one of Tony Blair's great legacies, was, in my opinion, the push for almost over-education. So I get the idea that it's great, he said it 3 times, didn't he? So he must have really meant it. But, to send people down to university all the time and this, that, and the other, okay. But what I'm seeing, and a lot of parts of the north of England, are people who might want to go and get a degree in, something from, university miles away that actually isn't, high up any kind of university list whatsoever, as opposed to actually maybe staying in the local area and getting a practical trade. That now, a lot of the time, is frowned upon, okay? And wrongly so, in my opinion. I have no idea what is going on when I pop the bonnet on my car. That is a dereliction of duty. I might be able to give you a relatively intricate, if not somewhat waffly example as to what I think should be happening in red wall seats, but I cannot even tell you where the oil goes in front of my car. It's a practical trade here. There's trades up and down the country that people need to be more proud of. And actually, I think that can help relocalize economies. And that's something that we need to look at. Do you need to go and just get a degree in David Beckham studies from the University of Staffordshire? Or actually, is it perfectly acceptable for you to go and do what you're great at, which might be plumbing?
Patrick, you are the classic metrosexual man. You do not know what goes on under a bonnet.
I've got no idea.
The other problem is, though, they've made cars so high tech in terms of the electrics that, for goodness sake, even if
no one's got a clue,
they blow it up anyway.
Well, listen, we've got about 8 minutes or so left. I want to give the panelists an opportunity, if they can, because we know the government got nothing else to do today. They're all watching this. So if you could say to our dear Prime Minister one policy that he should pursue to level up, what would it be? I'm going to start where we began. If I could go straight to John Mills. John, one policy that this government could implement to support the levelling up agenda, what would it be?
Well, I think it's really incredibly important to rebalance the economy and get manufacturing up from where it is at the moment, it's around about 10% of GDP, to at least somewhere around about 15%. And I think that's really important for at least 4 different reasons. One is that jobs in manufacturing pay more than they do in services. We've got 10% of GDP coming from about 8% of our labour force, which suggests that productivity is about 25% higher in manufacturing than it is in services. The second reason for manufacturing is that if you're going to rebalance the economy and get some sort of equality between London and the rest of the country, this is the way to do it. But there's a massive difference in gross value added at the moment. The last sort of figures were for 2017. Those showed that gross value added per head of the population in London was £48,000. Whereas in the northeast and Wales, it was only 20,000. That's a difference of more than 50%. The third thing is that we really urgently need to have more manufacturing, because that's where productivity increases come from, much more than they do in services. And finally, we're just not paying our way in the world. We just haven't got enough to sell to the rest of the world to pay our way, which is why we've got a huge balance of payments deficit. And I don't think any of these huge problems we've got with lack of manufacturing are going to be sorted out unless it's profitable to invest in this country rather than somewhere else. And I must say, I'm surprised the IEA isn't behind all this, because you believe in the profit motive just as much as I do. And if you can't make any money out of investing in manufacturing in the UK, people won't do it. And I think that the most important thing of all, therefore, is to do something around our macroeconomic policy, our competitiveness, our exchange rate, to make sure that it pays to invest in manufacturing in the UK. That's the really big message which I think the government needs to get across.
Well, John, I think they heard that loud and clear. I'm now going to go to Philip. Philip, one policy area that our Prime Minister, who's currently tucking into his afternoon bank holiday roast, what should he be doing to get the levelling up agenda going?
Okay, well, I mean, John's just challenged me, well, he's challenged me several times, but the debate's never really come round back to me on this issue on the exchange rate, which we've debated for hours, if not weeks and weeks, in various ways. My line on that really is very straightforward, that a country cannot determine its real exchange rate. If you do anything to try to reduce your exchange rate, it's likely in the long run to lead to inflation, and you get back to where you started. And even if it did reduce its real exchange rate, that basically means that what you sell abroad is worth less than it otherwise would be. So although it may create more jobs, they will be relatively low productivity jobs, which is why we have these comparisons with China. Of course, and national income per head in China is a quarter of national income per head in the UK. And we can't compete with China on that basis. We'll just become an even lower productivity economy. So what would I do? Well, as I said at the beginning, I don't think there is a magic solution here. That there is no, you can't really point to a country which has said, right, let's pursue a regional policy as such, nor indeed even people often talk about Silicon Valley in California, but that actually almost happened by accident. It's very difficult to plan these things. So what I would like to see is much more experimentation. And I take all the points about education. I think that's really important. But I suppose if I were to do one thing, it would be genuine localization of local government with both tax raising and spending responsibilities, and regulatory responsibilities also being devolved. So you just got more different things being tried, and policies which suited local areas rather than everything being dictated from Westminster. That might have the side effect as well of just sort of removing that drift towards London, which has happened over the last 30 years of almost everything. Clever people, regulatory authorities, the financial services industry, and everybody that has anything to do with government now has to sort of locate within a short distance of Westminster, or they're just not influential.
Well, thank you for that, Philip. I think we have the title for another event here, you know, perhaps the exchange rate, the debate, Philip and John. I think we can organise that back to the future. Caroline, one policy for our Prime Minister for levelling up, what would it be?
It's really hard, isn't it, to pick one. I think actually one thing we don't pay enough attention to is actually reskilling people while they're in work. I think, you know, too often, and I think about when Jarvis, a firm, you know, went sort of under, and a lot of people in Doncaster who worked for them, who'd gone from the mines to working into Jarvis, suddenly found themselves out of work for the first time in their lives. And it seems to me, in a lot of situations, we have to, the mark of a country's success is about how we cope with change and how we help people cope with change. And, you know, it seems to me there's something to learn from some other countries about when you know technology is changing, that some types of work are going to decline in numbers of jobs, or there's other areas of work that are growing. For goodness sake, let's have an opportunity to retrain people before they're unemployed. So either two things on that, you help particularly small and medium-sized businesses to, you know, get on top of the new technology, new forms of production, and therefore their workers within that, so they can adapt. But also, if it means looking for another job, people can go into those new jobs that are being created as well. And I just don't think there's enough attention given to that at all in our country. I think in some of the Scandi countries, you know, they look where the, you know, what's happening, and they say, right, now's the time to retrain people rather than waiting for them to be out of work. And I think that would be something really solid that we could do, and help people have hope about that they can make that move. God's sake, we've been banging on for years that nobody can rely on one job for life, and telling everybody they've got to move with the program and understand they've got to be more flexible and all of this. Well, for goodness sake, give them the means to be flexible, whether it's within their sector that they're working in or moving to another area as well. And I'm absolutely with Patrick, if I can just throw in. I mean, people talk about the super highway. I just like to be on the highway. I mean, you know, if there's one thing we can take from this pandemic, I mean, it's probably in the health service. You know, we've turbocharged the use of technology in the health service in a way that we probably hadn't done before, in terms of how we use technology, having GP appointments online where it's appropriate and what have you. But there's huge parts of our country that just aren't connected. And if you're looking for businesses to invest, one of the first things they're going to say is, can I be connected, not just to London, but to Hong Kong? You know, I mean, this is what it's about. And I'm, you know, I think I'm just fed up of, you know, prime ministers going back a few years now, always talking about this, but never delivering. And the mobile companies and the broadband companies not doing their bit for the country. So I had to throw that one in as well.
No, absolutely fine, Caroline. And last but not least, Patrick, your top ask from this government in the levelling up agenda.
Yeah, look, personally, I would actually try and push them to maybe stick to some promises or based around actually reducing immigration. I'm not going to go on some massive, I'm not crowbarring in some kind of anti-immigration rant here whatsoever. It's nothing like that. It's that my opinion in the economic sense is that high levels of mass immigration year on year can keep things in flux and can help things moving, but actually can keep things at a relatively chaotic level as well. Well, in terms of things like putting pressure on public services or the housing crisis or whatever, if we're topping up the numbers of people coming every single year by quite significant numbers in areas as well, a lot of the time disproportionately, that are already struggling with things like public services, etc., that can have a massive issue. If we reduce that, I would say that might allow us to kind of get things a little bit more settled, really, and therefore can help us kind of spend money in a more targeted way in those areas. And I think that's something that I would always challenge, because I think a lot of people who do have money and a lot of people who live in areas where there is extreme wealth or just a nice amount of wealth, frankly, actually, are not always the ones who live in areas where there is high mass immigration on an annual basis. And therefore I do think that those areas can tend to be somewhat above it slightly. So, you know, the local schools that you might get in Hampstead, for example, would maybe not feel the pinch in the same way that perhaps local schools somewhere in Blackburn might do on exactly the same issue. And so I personally believe if you want to level up the country, perhaps the best way to do it in an obvious sense there will be to reduce immigration. I would also say that it makes sense in a political sense as well, because I know there's a lot of immigration scores very, very highly if you go around a lot of the Red Wall seats and they talk about what are their biggest issues that they personally regard as affecting the country at the moment. And immigration will always be in the top three of those issues. It would pass the pub test, as it were. Any pub that you went in, every single person would always mention immigration, rightly or wrongly, in one of their lists there. And so that for me would be an area where I think they could have an easy win politically and potentially in an economically, practically sense as well.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, we've had our hour, and I want to thank all of our panelists for giving up an hour on their bank holiday Monday. Not that it matters anymore, all the days roll into one at the minute. So unfortunately, it's all we've got time for today. Thank you to everyone, John, Philip, Caroline and Patrick, for joining us. Thank you for everyone who's joined and who've contributed with their questions in the chat. If you're interested in similar events hosted by the IEA, you can find out details, future events on their website, www.iea.org.uk, and all the past events are on their YouTube channel as well. To find out more about the Institute for Prosperity, their website is www.instituteforprosperity.org.uk. Thank you very much again for joining us, and do enjoy the rest of your bank holiday weekend.